Right, first and foremost, thanks very much indeed to the organising committee, I think for emphasis, Kevin, for inviting me to speak here today. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm just going to talk a little bit today about some work we're doing looking at ground nesting birds on Dartmoor. And John Walters has alluded to some of it earlier. And this really is in part for us a bit about a data gathering exercise to try and help provide some insights of data and information that hopefully we can use in terms of their conservation. Now, I am not an avian biologist or an ecologist like Malcolm, that's all in my profession. I'm actually an ecotoxicologist, and that's a long word, meaning my team try to better understand how chemicals that we all use and put in the environment, including those agrochemicals, impact on wildlife. And so what we do, in particular in my team, is develop molecular technologies, advanced technologies, so we can better understand how those chemicals get into organisms, get into wildlife, and how they have their effects. And so this little image here is just showing you a zebrafish we've created. It's a transgenic zebrafish, and it glows green in target tissues responding to certain classes of chemicals. And in that way, we can better start to understand what the health implications are. And the only reason for saying that is that increasingly we're reliant or using advanced technologies, including molecular technologies, and including things like satellite technologies, to help understand birds and bird populations and how they work. And that's fundamentally going to be important in terms of future conservation for our birds. Equally, however, and certainly where everyone can, and many people do, sitting in this room, get involved, is that bird conservation in the future is going to require those good old-fashioned, high-quality, traditional field skills. Although an ecotoxicologist by training, by profession, if you like, my passion in life is natural history, it's wildlife biology. A little bit akin to John Walters in many ways in terms of that passion. And all aspects of the animal kingdom. It doesn't matter if it's an insect, it doesn't matter if it's an amphibian, a reptile, or a bird. I have a real passion. And my drive to get involved in this work stems from that passion. And I have a particular passion for local wildlife, for Devon wildlife. I'm a Devon boy, and I can revert into a Devon accent if everyone needs me to. I'm very lucky. I live now on the close to the edge of Dartmoor, and Dartmoor is my home turf, if you like, in terms of where I spend a lot of my time in terms of watching wildlife. And Dartmoor, we've already heard today, is a fundamentally important refuge for lots of our birds, including some of our rapidly declining and fairly rare now in terms of upland breeding birds, things like the ring ouzel and the dunlin we've heard about today. Dunlin, the most southerly nesting population actually in the world, occurs on Dartmoor. But the story I'm going to talk to you about today, the project I'm talking about today, is a project that started back in 2008. And I was up early on the moor as I am at weekends with a camera very early and trying to photograph some birds, actually trying to photograph a specific bird, which I'll return to later. And these two gentlemen disturbed me. They knocked on my hive's door. And normally when that happens, I get rather annoyed because you've been sitting there for a long period of time trying to photograph something and of course it doesn't come back. But this turned to be a rather exceptional and wonderful encounter. This is Mark Lawrence and Mark Penn. You've heard about them earlier. And it transpires that they were trying to find nests in this region around Benford and Holmore up on Dartmoor. And so we struck up a conversation, well they struck up a conversation, and I asked them whether they might be interested in terms of focusing their great skills in terms of being birders and being nesters to try and get a more in-depth understanding, more in-depth data in relation to nesting birds in and around this study area. And they seemed to be really keen to get involved. And they then recruited a guy called Dave Scott, some of you all know, fantastic local birder, a fantastic nester too. And like in many of these things, of course, we co-opted my good friend John Walters into it. So we had a team of people who are really interested in terms of trying to better understand the nesting birds in and around this region at Benford. And we were interested in all the birds which were nesting there, ground nesting birds, but other birds too. And some of the residents we have, including things like yellowhammer, stonechat, redpoll, and we have a few Dartford warblers, of course things like reedpuntlings and skylarks. And then it's a really important area too for a number of the migrants that come back from places like Iberia, for example, things like the Meadow Pipits, and of course the longer distance migrants. Malcolm's talked about things like Whinchats too. So we're interested in terms of getting as much information as we could in terms of the plethora of nesting birds in the area, but we're particularly interested in terms of getting depth of data too. And so we decided in part to focus on three main species in terms of study in this area. And the first of those is the Whinchats, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but this is just the BTO map of showing essentially changing breeding abundance from sort of late 80s, 90s to the latest census in 2008 to 2011. And grey just means bad, basically. It means either declining, or if it's dark grey, it's significantly declining. And the sort of sandy, pinky, orangey colour means it's sort of stable. If it's bright, it's increasing. And what you can clearly see from this map, essentially, is that Whinchats not doing too good, to say the very, very least. And in fact, in Devon it's declined about 50% and across England about 56%. So it really is in very significant decline. And actually the picture for our second study species, the Meadow Pipit, isn't that great either. So about a 40% or so decline. Our third chosen species, somewhat better status, is Stonechat, and here you can see it's doing pretty generally across the UK and across England. It's doing pretty well. Maybe a little bit of a decline. Devon's suffering a little bit of a decline, but certainly it's doing a lot better than the Whinchats and the Meadow Pipit. So what do we set out to do? Very simple, basic approach, really. What we charted out a study area, and I didn't realise how ambitious it would be. We charted out a 2 square kilometre area. So that's the area we charted out. And then the method essentially was regular visits, 4 days a week, largely by Mark Lawrence and Mark Penny. Systematic searches for nesting birds to find those nests and identify obviously the species, the location, and then follow them in terms of seeing how successful they were. Mark is a qualified ringer, so he rings the birds before they're fledged. Then that information is sent through the nest record card systems to the BTO. So simple, straightforward process. Well, finding nests, the odd nest, is relatively easy. Even I can do that. When John and I were up on the wall, we used to stumble across a few nests. But as John said, getting introduced to people like Mark Lawrence and Mark Penny, I realised it was a whole new art. This is a classic example of really interacting with people who know their stuff, who have experience in terms of doing this. So actually, in terms of finding nests, there are all sorts of behavioural phenotype, all behaviours that the birds show and different bird species show in terms of giving an indication whether they're nesting. There are even certain types of behaviours in which give an indication in terms of what stage that nest is at. I mean, one example for Meadow Pipits is that the male will feed the female on the nest, and so he will come in with food and he'll call her off the nest. And by watching that interaction, you can get a good pinpoint on the location of that nest. Other things like Whinchats, a similar thing happens. If you get close to a Whinchat nest, it's the female that incubates the egg. The male calls her off the nest, then actually you can watch the female going back. So just by knowing some aspects of bird behaviour, that gives you a real advantage in terms of finding those nests. And there are some wonderful birds, like, of course, the grasshopper warbler. It migrates all the way back from Africa to Dartmoor. Then it spends most of its time walking through the vegetation. They're quite hard to spot during the breeding season. So to locate the nests of these birds, you need to be on site early when they have first arrived back, because the males sit up on top of bushes reeling, just giving that wonderful grasshopper call early in the morning or late in the afternoon or on really wet grey days like today. So just by knowing aspects of the bird behaviour, we started to learn from these guys, actually, we could find nests too. So experience is really important, patience, of course, and then also what's happened over time as we start to better understand our study area. Like anything, your home patch site familiarity is helping hugely too. It's required huge commitment in terms of the dedication of the team to go up to find these nests. Again, mainly Mark Lawrence and Mark Penny, they're up there 4 days a week, at dawn, sometimes even before dawn, sometimes they spend the whole day there. But they are awarded some wonderful views and from wonderful sites like this is Dawn and Farm and so forth. And you can never tire of finding birds' nests. They're fantastic creations. Everyone somewhat different, made with different materials, lined with different materials. Here's a wonderful reed bunting nest with those lovely chocolate swirl eggs, and here's a Whinchats with those sky blue eggs. So these are the data. So since 2008, till 2015, over 1,300 nests have now been found and charted on our study site, mainly for the Meadow Pipit, Stonechat and Whinchats, but some skylark and some other species too. And this is the number of nests which have been found over successive years. And you see there's a gradual increase. Now, I'd love to say to you that's because the numbers of birds are increasing on the moor. That's not the case. The team are getting better, they're spending a bit more time on the moor, certainly in part of things like site familiarity. And this dip here in 2014 was when Mark Lawrence and Dave Scott went to Mongolia for a month during breeding season. So just illustrates you how important these guys are. So we have all this data. It's wonderful having all this data, but of course you've got to make sense from that data. Data doesn't mean anything. You have to extract the knowledge from this data. And so it took me a while, but eventually I managed to cobble together enough money through the University of Exeter to employ a PhD student to start analysing data. And we were lucky to take on Sarah Zonadil, who's been a fantastic PhD student. She works with the field team, and she's starting to analyse these data now. And so just look in terms for the Meadow Pipit and for the Whinchat and for the Whinchat here and for the Stonechat. just starting to look at these are the cumulative data, or the mean data across all the study years, and this is the week across the bottom. This is the number of nests here. And you can see first and foremost that the stonechat starts to breed earlier on our study site compared to the other species. It'll have 2, 3, sometimes even 4 broods, but it starts the earliest. And then we have the Meadow Pipit, it's bimodal distribution, so 2 broods essentially. And then we have the Whinchats. The Whinchats, of course, breeds later because it has a lot further from sub-Saharan Africa. But the important thing to illustrate here already, we're starting to see that the breeding seasons, although we overlap, we've got a bit of displacement. We've got a bit of what appears to be also niche partitioning going on between these 3 species. They vie for similar resources, basically. So already we're starting to see somewhat different in terms of the breeding periods. It never ceases to amaze me, and Malcolm would know much more here, but in terms of these birds, like the cuckoo and like the Whinchats, come all the way back from Africa. They arrive at a very, very similar time point, year on, year out. And if you look for something like the Whinchat, it's week 22 plus or minus 1 week. One exception here, essentially. So we're incredibly robust, I suppose, really, in terms of their timing in recent times in terms of coming back to the study site. A little bit different with the stonechat, it's a bit more variable. And that might be because the stonechat has a shorter migration distance, arrives back earlier, and it probably depends a bit more on the proximate factors, depending on what, it probably looks out and says, what's the weather condition today? Is it a bit warmer? Has the vegetation grown a bit more? Are there plenty of inverts around? And what Sarah's going to do now, she's trying to break down some of these data to try and tease apart interrelationships in terms of breeding success. And so, for example, are there particular periods during that incubation time or nesting where the nests and all the chicks are more vulnerable to things like predation, for example? So she's trying to tease apart what elements relate to success. And just look at this bottom panel here when we're looking at breeding success from egg to fledging. It's amazing how consistent on our study area the breeding success of the Whinchats is, 50 or 55% or so. But it's somewhat more variable for the Meadow Pipit and the stonechat. And this little blip here was, John mentioned it earlier in his presentation. This is 2012, when the stonechat started breeding about 2 weeks earlier, or 10 days earlier than they normally tend to do. Then we had a very wet spring, and all those chicks essentially got washed out. Predation. Predation is quite a big player in terms of loss of ground nesting birds. Of course, to some extent, predation is a natural check in a natural system, but we do have this, I might say, over-healthy populations of foxes on our side of our part of the moor. We certainly have corvids, they predate quite a lot of the eggs and the chicks. John mentioned adders, we have a good healthy population of adders, and they predate some of the eggs and the chicks too. So what Sarah's doing now, she started building up this spatial map in terms of breeding distributions of our stonechat, of our Meadow Pipit, and of our Whinchats. And the idea is she's trying to better understand this issue in terms of niche partition. What are the things those birds really require, or how is breeding success related to the type of habitat in which they're in? So she's GIS mapping the habitat in the study area and looking for interrelationships and links between not just where those birds are nesting, but how successful they are. So in terms of that data and information we gathered so far, we talk and link with the Dartmoor National Parks Authority, and we appreciate the pressures on organisations like that in terms of the pulls and the desires and the uses of the moor. And they, of course, they stem everything from various farming practices to tourism, to preserving archaeological sites, to try and protect wildlife. And sometimes they don't necessarily work particularly well. It's a very, very difficult equation balance. And I think we all recognise that. And for our small part in terms of this work that we're doing, we're just trying to provide data and information that hopefully can be used in a constructive way in terms of conservation and management of parts of the moor. So just 3 take-homes from these ground nesting birds information so far. The first is that actually, on our study site, we've got a pretty healthy population of some of the nationally declining birds. And I was just talking to Mark Lawrence over lunch, and he was saying that year on, year out, we're finding more and more birds on that study site. So I think fundamentally, our study site, Dartmoor, is hugely important, not just from Devon's point of view, but nationally, from a national point of view in some of these breeding birds. What we are finding is that the stonechats are starting to breed before the end of the burning or the swathing system. The burning on the moor is used to control gorse and to enable things like grazing. So there's a bit of a mismatch there in terms of when that's allowed, when the season allowed for that versus when some of the stonechats are starting to nest. We've also found that in terms of bracken control, and that's both physical and chemical, things like glyphosate are used on the moor, and that's used largely to help preserve archaeological sites. That doesn't work necessarily that well in concert with things like breeding whinchats, because those areas in which it's applied in and around the Brecon are some of the key areas of some of the whinchats are breeding. So perhaps if it was possible to control that bracken 2 weeks later in the season, things would be a lot better possibly for the whinchats. So I told a bit of a white lie. So I've told the story in terms of ground nesting birds and how it came about and what we're trying to do. And a major driver for that study, when I first met Mark Lawrence and Mark Penny, is the fact that I have an absolute obsession with this bird. I don't know if anyone saw Autumn Watch last night. I sort of like it, don't in many ways. But anyway, and Chris Packham said the best bird in the world is a sparrow. He's wrong. This is the best bird in the world without doubt, the cuckoo. Some of you, I know you've heard quite a bit about the cuckoo this morning, but the cuckoo actually is a phenomenal and fantastically interesting bird species. There are different races, of course, where cuckoos have adapted to mimic the eggs of different birds. And the gentee, or the race that we have on Dartmoor, of course, is that of Meadow Pipits. And then people like Dave Leach, they work on the species, the race that parasitises things like we will. And they produce these eggs that match the eggs of their host. Not always. There's one example, one exception, and that's the dunnock. The dunnock produces lovely blue eggs, but the cuckoo that parasitises that dunnock still has a whitish egg with sort of like browny red freckles. And no one really knows why that is the case. Now, it might be because clearly the dunnock is not discerning enough to be able to eject the egg, but why does that happen? And if you talk to people like Nick Davies, and he really is the guru on cuckoos, his thought is that the cuckoo has been adopted more recently in terms of a host species by the cuckoo. At least the incidence of parasitism has only increased to a level where it's even worth the dunnock trying to eject those eggs in recent times. But actually, this is not a dunnock nest. This is a fantastic find by Rob and Stella. I think Stella spoke to one. And this is actually a whinchat nest with a cuckoo egg in it. This was found on Dartmoor last year. Now, this is something that people call egg dumping. So again, people like Nick Davies, and he believes that cuckoos will lay their eggs in other birds' nests if they can't find a nest which is at the right stage for the particular race, the particular host species that they normally parasitise. That's possible, but it does go against the grain a little bit in terms of those fantastic evolutionary processes which has driven that adaptation of the cuckoo to actually find and lay their eggs in their host species. And if you look at, or read people like Edgar Chance's work in the 1920s, he had some fantastic information and data and studies showing that a female cuckoo watching her survey area knows where the Meadow Pipit nests are. She'll even destroy some Meadow Pipit nests to get them breeding, to get them producing eggs again, so she's ready to lay her eggs into that nest. So why does this egg dumping go? No one really knows. But anyway, they go through this, the cuckoos on Dartmoor, which are parasiting Meadow Pipits, go through this cycle basically. They produce that egg that clearly wonderfully matches the Meadow Pipit egg. Even if you look at the UV spectrum, because birds see the UV spectrum, the patterning is just truly wonderful. It's about 10% bigger in size. It has to be, because when the cuckoo hatches, it has to be strong enough to be able to push out the eggs or the chicks in the nest. It actually hatches 11 or 12 days. I think John might have a discrepancy there. 11 or 12 days. 11 or 12 days incubation for the cuckoo. And the reason it can do that is the cuckoo has a real trick up its sleeve. It holds that fertilised egg inside a cavity for 24 hours. And that gives it a 30-hour plus head start in terms of incubation against the Meadow Pipit. So she plops it in from that last egg of Meadow Pipit to be laid, and then for the most part, the cuckoo hatches soon. But if there's a bit of asynchrony there, even if this poor little guy hatches here or girl hatches here, it will soon be forced out by the cuckoo. Now, it never ceases to amaze me in terms of when you see a young cuckoo in a Meadow Pipit nest, which is when it's 7 days, 10 days old. It's totally alien. Yeah, this bird cannot recognise self. Meadow Pipits cannot recognise self because they carefully nurture this alien in the nest. And when you think about how all birds, how Meadow Pipits have evolved in terms of they're able to migrate unaided all the way back from Iberia to their study sites to within 20 metres of where they nested last year. They can identify, a female can identify a fit male by the way it flies. They can actually go around and find the foodstuffs that give the best nutrition, producing eggs. The females can do so. Yet they can't recognise this in and it's wholly different when you see the cuckoos first arrive back on our study site in Dartmoor. These pipits know their bad news. Air and salts continually. But when that cuckoo chick hatches, These parents look after it and nurture it carefully as they can. And indeed, when that cuckoo fledgling is close to migrating back to Africa, 3 weeks, sometimes 4 weeks after it's left the nest, it's 6 times the mass of the adult bird. So, sad thing is, and I know we've heard about it there, and I'm going to be very quick here. Cuckoos are in huge decline in England, and it's a bit of a contrasting picture compared to that in Scotland, as Malcolm said. 62-65% decline, something like that across England. And if you look at these Devon maps, this really brings it home. We talk about data and information and lobbying and trying to get people to stand up and really view what's going on. This is the last census that was done across Devon. This is the most recent one here. Look how important Dartmoor is to reference the cuckoos now. Hugely, fundamentally important. So why is it declining in England compared to that in Scotland? The honest answer is we don't know. There are lots of things that might relate to it, as Malcolm said, to its migration routes, and half its life actually on migration, 7,000 kilometre journey from the Congo back to Dartmoor. It's an obligate brood parasite, so is it its host species which are declining? Is that where the problem is? Dietary specialism, it has a fairly special diet, I'll just touch on in a minute. It might be clearly habitat and land use management, and these two are going to be linked. And of course aspects of things like climate too. So Malcolm's just beautifully illustrated in terms of his work with people like Chris Houston at the BTO doing the cuckoo tagging program. Essentially, a few of those have been tagged on Dartmoor too. And if you look in terms of, and I might be wrong here, Malcolm, and shadowed by Jan, if you look in terms of the migration routes of the birds being tagged in England and Wales generally, compared to that in Scotland, there's no clearly defined pattern in terms of difference for those in Scotland compared to that in England and Wales. They're fairly variable in terms of which routes they go, slightly east to the north side. Certainly it's the case that they also tend to return back inside. So it might be migration routes, possibly, but possibly not. Does it relate to the host species? Well, the meadow pipit has decreased, we've all heard about that. But the reed warbler and the dunnock in recent times haven't, and the cuckoos are still going down. So the evidence isn't very strong, really, for being related necessarily directly to the host species. But these, the birds, the cuckoos, the parasites, the dunnocks at least. This issue in terms of phenology, in terms of when the birds in which the cuckoos parasitize are starting breeding, is there a mismatch there? Well, certainly the breeding serum has been advanced in some of these birds. But also the return, if you look in history of the last 300-400 years, the cuckoos have returned more earlier to England as well, apart from about the last 50 years or so. So there may be some mismatch there, but that doesn't appear to be a driving factor in terms of the decline. If I had to put my money on one thing, I would put it on something in relation to diet, resources, food, and that might relate to the food itself and or the land in terms of how that's managed. And certainly it's the case that cuckoos have this amazing specialism in part of their diet is they feed on hairy caterpillars, essentially, moth caterpillars, and they have a special adaptation to their gut to be able to do so. They're quite toxic, some of these caterpillars and their hairs, and they actually evacuate part of their gut that allows them to actually feed on these caterpillars. And these, from Rothenstedt data, but not much wider data sets, including some of Devon Moth Group data too, these have undergone a precipitous decline in the last 20-25 years. 90% decline in the case of the government tiger. So lastly, in terms of our second project, we've got started on Dartmoor now, on our study area, and somewhat more widely on Dartmoor, is with Lowell Mills. So we talked to the RSPB and the National Environmental Research Council. We've got another second PhD project funded now, and we're looking into resources required by cuckoos on Dartmoor in terms of what do adults feed on, basically, what are the young fed on, does that differ from their meadow pipit nestlings? With the idea, can we start to get some hard data and information in terms of how does that resourcing in terms of the food stuff they feed on relate to the host project in terms of the land and the land management there. And this is a real classic example, this PhD, of a combination of traditional field skills, if you like, observational skills, and some high-tech stuff as well. So poor old Noel has been following around adult cuckoos on Dartmoor this last year, collecting feces as they drop them. And then what we're doing now, we're using the DNA sequencing technology, so we're actually sequencing those poos now, essentially, to find out what invertebrates they've been feeding on. We've also got a concerted program coming in now looking for the cuckoos in the nest, and also meadow pipits in the nest to do that work. I couldn't finish today without really acknowledging a second part to this cuckoo project. And this was really initiated with discussions with Sarah, and Sarah's really led this in combination with some fantastic support from Devon Birds and from Devon National Parks Authority as well. And one of the things we wanted to do in terms of this part, this so-called citizen science project on the cuckoo, was do two things. One is to try and engage more of the public in terms of the plight of the cuckoo, in terms of really getting out there what a desperate state this poor cuckoo is in. And secondly, to capture all the capabilities of people like yourselves sitting in the audience, who are out there with binoculars watching birds. And some of you I know will have fantastic field skills. And it's been a fantastic thing for us to do, in the sense that in 2014 we had 700 sightings, and last year we had 1,300 sightings. And this is helping us to locate and co-locate where the cuckoos are on the moor for our futures. So why do I do this? I'm really lucky individual. I'm lucky to be able to travel all parts of the world, all world's continents, search for weird and wonderful wildlife. But Devon is my home, and Dartmoor really does give me a sense of place. Getting involved with these projects and some of the fantastic people who support it really is a huge part of why I do what I do. And I don't think Dartmoor needs selling too much more perhaps today, but essentially Dartmoor is fundamentally important for so many of our resident and breeding birds, and not just from Devon's perspective, but from a national perspective. I've just mentioned out on the open moorland, but of course there's the wonderful woodlands with its essential fantastic resident bird species. We've heard about some of the migrants, that quintessential trio that come breed in our woodlands in Dartmoor. We get these fantastic floral blooms across Dartmoor during the autumn time, and those reaches support things like nightjar and of course wheatear, and of course, and John did these fantastic illustrations, drawings showing the ring ouzels using the fueling depots on their migration routes. Then the rivers that cascade down off the moor is a whole different assemblage of bird species, including one bird that's actually doing rather well, increased by 1,500% or something in terms of last month. And thanks very much to Marcus back in it's actually an S Marcus. So I'm going to finish there, but just finally and say that, from the time of Aristotle until now, this bird, the cuckoo, has absolutely fascinated mankind. It's an extraordinary evolution harmonies between the cuckoo and this case the meadow cuckoo. But equally importantly, the cuckoo is the harbourer of spring. It's part of our culture. It's part of our heritage. If we really can't find a refuge on somewhere like Dartmoor and Devon for the cuckoo in terms of bird protection in the UK, I think we're going to fail on everything. Finishing now in terms of those people, just the funders, thanks very much for supporting the project, but actually most importantly, these people here who have given their time, energy and effort, largely free essentially, because they have, like many people do in yours, they have this passion and desire to want to do something in terms of their contribution. Thank you.